Hi, this is William Henderson.
And this is B. McGraw.
And this is the Unjerked podcast. The Unjerked podcast is affiliated with B. McGraw's website,
which is the Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology, or jabd.com.
And unlike that website, instead of writing fake journal articles, we look at real academic research on various topics. So this episode, we're going to focus on the topic of urban design. All right, so this episode is kind of a continuation. It's kind of like the same universe of subreddits as the episodes on housing and public transit. It's sort of a extension of that.
So a lot of r/f cars and
r/f cars.
All of the subreddits where people are just complaining about not liking the city. There's so many posts about that.
There's r/urban hell that just shows like a lot of it is just like normal photos of a city.
Let's not forget r/Georgism, which is honestly gaining a lot of traction on Reddit right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because I used to not, like probably a year ago, I've never heard of Georgism.
Yeah, and we talked about it in one of the podcasts, and now most people online, at least in the political subreddits, seem to know what Georgism is, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. So, urban design, how's it different from housing and transit? I mean, I think it's pretty similar. I think housing is more like for private plots of land, what types of things are built, whereas urban design is like how is the public space built? So it's kind of like two sides of a single coin. So it's like, well, how are the streets laid out? How are the parks laid out?
It's pretty a lot of that type of stuff. Pretty related to each other, though.
For sure, and also transit is really because, like like street design has a big influence on public transit, obviously. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of talking about that sort of the public space, which is, even the most hardcore libertarians basically admit, like, okay, the government should own the roads. Mm-hmm. There's probably a couple that are like, oh no, we should have like a series of toll roads owned by independent, road companies. But like, no, I've never heard anyone seriously make that argument. So I feel like this is the public space is kind of, people kind of acknowledge that essentially the local city government basically owns or manages that space. I think a good way to look at this is from externalities, and then we can kind of like bring it together at the end. So what kind of externalities matter in cities? So there's a lot of things. There's, why does traffic matter? Because it increases commute times. It leads to emissions. So traffic's obviously a bad externality, negative externality. So is noise. Nobody likes, people like birds chirping, but they don't like cars, zooming around. There's also the mental health aspect of like, how does a city's design affect your mental health? And then there's collisions, vehicular collisions, accidents, etc., which are like a huge cause of death. There's heat, the urban island effect or something. I forgot what it's called.
Yeah, it's like an urban...
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. Heat island.
And then you have fiscal sustainability, like how fiscally sustainable is a given city layout. There's socializing, is a city design, does it encourage socializing in community or does it discourage it? And then there's inequality. How does it affect inequality? So those are kind of the main things I could think of. Maybe there's a couple other things, but those are kind of the main that come to mind.
We might think of some more along the way.
Yeah. So when it comes to, I'm going to start with what I think is probably the most important in many ways is like, or one of the most important is like traffic accidents, So this data is from Wikipedia because it's just like, basic statistics. But in the US in 2022, over 42,000 people died in traffic accidents. That's like
42,000. Wow.
Yeah. And that's like, I think after like cancer, I mean, there's obviously like the certain diseases that cause, death, cancer, heart disease, pneumonia, etc. There's things that typically kill older people. And after that, it's, mostly like accidents are pretty, car accidents are pretty up there.
They are the most dangerous thing that most of us do every day, for sure.
Yeah, I would say for under a certain age, it's probably the leading cause of death. And when it comes to kind of per capita numbers, so in Zimbabwe, that it's the highest at 41.2 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants a year.
Wow.
A lot of sub-Saharan African countries had really high traffic fatality rates. I'm not really sure why.
Well, I'm thinking a lot of. Have you ever watched one of those Top Gear or Grand Tour episodes where they go to some really remote African country?
I never saw those shows.
They will stress you out just watching them drive around the cities and the countryside. It's nuts.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. Is it because the roads are like not well maintained? Is it because a lot of people ride scooters instead of cars, and so if they get hit, they just like die? Basically, I'm not really sure. So that the highest is
stuff like that. There's some wild videos of that. I think it also gets wild because they're just always going on these really crazy back roads that just destroy whatever vehicle they're in.
So, and then the lowest, so US, so Zimbabwe is at 41.2, the US is at 12.84. And then the lowest, non-microstate countries hover from like around 2.1 to around 3. And it's a lot of like Scandinavian countries, East Asian countries, things like that. So, the US has like basically a 6 times higher traffic fatality rate than what we potentially could achieve if we had the same levels as those like lowest countries. And, over 42,000 deaths, if we were 6 times lower, that would be like, that's around 7,000, I think. So you'd be reducing fatalities by around 35,000 every single year if we had, the right policies. And that is an absolutely massive number.
Yeah. I think it's so high in the US primarily because, well, we probably do way more driving than most other countries.
I mean, that's probably the biggest reason why. And also people just kind of like accept it as a fact of life. They're like, this is a thing that happens,
When I looked at the conservative subreddits on like, why do you not like, there were a ton of Ask Conservative posts on like, why do you not like cities? And the number one response is, I hate driving in cities.
Yeah, I think the point is like, ideally you shouldn't be driving inside a city. You should be, taking the bus or riding the bike or something.
Yeah.
But that's sort of a separate thing. So anyways, when it comes to like externalities related to traffic, so that's emissions, commute time. So they've done kind of research on like, how do you fix this or how do you do this optimally? So there's a couple things. There's this article that says Off the Grid and Back Again, the recent evolution of American street network planning and design. And basically this is like it's by Jeff Boeing, but basically he does this review of, how urban sort of street patterns have changed over the century. And so he's talking about griddedness, orientation order, straightness, four-way intersections, intersection density, et cetera, et cetera. So he said those things all declined from the 40s to the 90s, while dead ends and block lengths increased, but starting in 2000, those trends have rebounded. And it says higher griddedness is associated with less car ownership, which itself has a well-established relationship with vehicle kilometers traveled and greenhouse gas emissions, while controlling for density, home and household size, income, jobs, proximity, street network grain, and local topography. So the griddedness, which is, I don't know how exactly he, measured it, but basically how closely the road pattern aligns with a grid pattern, is an independent variable that leads to lower ownership and use of cars. And use of cars obviously correlates with traffic and emissions. So this shows that griddedness basically leads to more sort of pedestrian oriented lifestyle, I guess. And then there's this other article, Traffic Efficiency Applications Over Downtown Roads, a New Challenge for Intelligent Connected Vehicles by Eunice and a couple other, one other person. This is about how, autonomous vehicles work. So sort of like a slightly unrelated topic, but they do mention grid layout architecture of downtown areas provides several routes towards any targeted destination. And so essentially, the grid pattern is, when you think about it, kind of the most obvious way to efficiently move from one spot to another.
Well, I still think you'd get more radially, but that doesn't make any sense because then you would have a massive intersection in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, radially obviously doesn't work because you'd have just a massive 16 lane intersection in the middle.
Yeah.
And also when you think about what are other impractical, if you make a turn that's more than 90 degrees, I think it's pretty intuitively obvious that that's kind of dangerous. If you're at an intersection, because sometimes there's intersections that cross in an X shape, and if you have to turn in a 135 degree turn, it's just clearly not very efficient way of turning, because
that wouldn't make any sense. Also, with a gridded pattern in an urban environment, it's way easier to navigate with one-way roads, which typically work a lot better.
Yeah, and also just one rule is you probably shouldn't have turns that are more than 90 degrees. So that leaves either four-way intersections or three-way intersections. Either T intersections or four-way intersections. I guess you could do a honeycomb pattern, a hexagonal shapes or whatever.
Oh my gosh.
But practically speaking, when you think about all these different factors, and then also a lot of suburban subdivisions, they'll have one feeder road that goes into the subdivision, and it kind of branches out almost like in a blood vessel pattern. That's obviously way less efficient because there's one road where if you block that road, nobody inside can get out.
I'm definitely putting the honeycomb pattern road structure into my back pocket for the next fantasy novel I write.
So
That'd
grid patterns,
so strange.
So grid patterns are just obviously a just it's, you can get places most efficiently. There's multiple egress points. Turns are pretty intuitive. It's a pretty obvious choice.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's limited by topography. So if you're if there's a steep hill or whatever,
it's a little harder.
Obviously, yeah, you can't just do a grid ignoring that shape. You have to kind of follow the contours. But practically speaking, if you're building a new city, that's kind of the obvious shape to pick.
It's because the Romans did it, isn't it?
Did the Romans do grid patterns?
Everywhere except for Rome.
I know a lot of old cities oftentimes will have very kind of messy patterns. I know Boston's like that because Boston's streets were basically designed off of cow paths, the paths that the cows
I think
followed.
It's a matter of did they plan it or not. So Rome, ancient Rome was impossible to navigate because they just made the roads as they went, so there was no rhyme or reason to how it worked. But when the Romans made a city or reestablished one or gentrified one, out in the colonies or something, they would make it super gridded.
I mean, it works,
It did, but
and then
you could really easily get lost in Rome.
And then the other two things that reduce traffic is, we've already talked about these. So one is zoning reform. One is, this one we talked about. We talked about zoning reform. So mixed use zoning. There's this article by Tian, Ewing, and Joyce from the University of Utah. And their first article is called Traffic Generated by Mixed Use Developments, 13 Regions Study Using Consistent Measures of Built Environment. And basically, they're talking about mixed use developments, MXDs. And they look at 13 large and diverse metropolitan regions. And it shows MXDs with diverse activities on site were shown to capture a large share of trips internally so that traffic impacts of the MXDs were reduced relative to conventional suburban developments. And then they did a follow-on paper called Traffic Generated by Mixed-Use Developments, a follow-up 31 regions study. So this is a much larger study with 31 regions. And it says well-designed MXDs have walk shares of more than 50% on internal trips. So, it's kind of pretty intuitive. Like for me, I live in a mixed-use area, and the gym is 5 minutes away. The convenience store is 5 minutes away. Coffee is 5 minutes away. So each of those, in previous neighborhoods I've lived in would be like a 10-minute drive.
Oh my gosh, I'd
be mixing up with traffic of people commuting or whatever. But for me now, literally, I just walk 5 minutes. So pretty, when you kind of really think about it, it's pretty obvious that this would lead to lower traffic. Next is densification. Yeah, so this article says the influence of urban form compactness on CO2 emissions and its threshold effect, evidence from cities in China in the Journal of Environmental Management. Basically, they look at urban form compactness, UFC. It shows that it has a negative relationship with CO2 emissions. So, again, kind of obvious. If everything's closer together, then you don't need to drive as far, you emit less CO2. And then next, there's an article in the Journal of Travel Behavior and Society, the impact of congestion and dedicated lanes on-demand multimodal transit systems by Liu and others. It says, dedicated bus lanes results show significantly improved travel times and adoption of the system if you have dedicated lanes. It talks about Atlanta. I don't know if they have dedicated lanes in Atlanta.
I think they do in some places. I can't think of it because I walk everywhere. So I didn't bother. I don't think I would even know. I mean, they do have certain dedicated lanes and like the Peach Pass lane and whatnot.
It's pretty easy. Like, how do you reduce traffic? Well, obviously have less people driving. How do you do that?
Either have it where no one has to drive or make public transit work better.
Yeah. So if you have grid pattern streets, mixed use dense areas, and then you have bus lanes, that's kind of what you need to do.
Okay. First circle jerk statement, you can debunk if you can, is that buses aren't safe.
I mean, I guess it depends on what city and neighborhood you're in. I think if you live in a city where, there's people, causing trouble on a bus, obviously that's a reason not to use it. But I do think a lot of people don't really research like, hey, are the buses sketchy where I live? That's just kind of like a built-in assumption that I think a lot of people have. I guess the big thing, the big fear people have with buses is it's a confined space with strangers. And there's something about that that's obviously kind of, some people find that uncomfortable.
I mean, it's generally less comfortable than being in your car for sure. I was in one in Paris the other day and it was packed. That was so uncomfortable just because it was so packed.
Yeah. So the next externality is noise. So how do you reduce noise in urban areas? So there's an article, how does the composition and configuration of green space influence urban noise? A systematic literature review in Current Landscape Ecology Reports by Stuhlmacher and others. And basically, their findings say that literature is in agreement that green space composition and configuration contributes to decreased noise level in a variety of ways. Greater total area, larger patches, taller trees, and deeper vertical vegetation were associated with greater noise reduction. Furthermore, clustered sets of green space patches and less compact individual patches were linked with lower noise level. So trees and greenery in general do an amazing job reducing noise in the city. So, obviously greenery can mean a lot of things. It could be, little shrubs, but probably mostly trees. Parks as well, because parks, that's like a big area with a ton of trees. And, it's a pretty relatively cheap solution as well. Because if you plant trees that are, well adapted to the climate, like local trees, then you don't have to really water them that much. And they just kind of grow on their own. And, other than like, I guess you'd have to worry about trees falling on power lines. So you want to make sure you don't get trees that are like too close or taller than the power lines. But if you have like medium-sized trees that are not a risk from that perspective, it seems like a pretty good idea.
Yeah, well, trees just make it nicer. I think there's going to be multiple points where the suggestion is trees in this podcast. One note, and this is a total Atlanta thing. You might remember from one time you've visited, but oh my goodness, one of the most annoying parts about the city in Atlanta is there's so many people that will just modify their car to be as noisy as freaking possible.
Yeah, or like I lived in a city once where people just drove around on like mopeds and stuff. Not mopeds, but like the motorcycles and these little these like dune buggy looking things at like freaking midnight, and would just be blasting music, and it's just like, really?
Oh yeah, it is a thing that people will do in the middle, because 99% of cars are like not adding that much noise to the environment whatsoever, other than like the occasional honk or something. But then there'll be like a handful of people, like once or twice an hour, that'll just go rah! And go crazy. And I had one friend that moved from like the 16th floor to the 3rd floor, and apparently it turned into a real issue for him, because it's like when you're up high enough, you barely know, like you'll notice it, but it's not a big deal. But when you're like right next to where it's happening, it gets really awful.
Yeah. So next is mental health. So is there urban design that can improve mental health? So again, a relatively similar theme. So there is a paper from Nature, which is one of the most famous journals out there. But this is Nature Medicine, and it says effects of urban living environments on mental health in adults. And this was written by a large number of people, a lot of collaborators. And they're basically talking about, what correlates. And they said, we found an environmental profile of social deprivation, air pollution, street network, and urban land use density that was positively correlated with an effective symptom group mediated by, okay, they're talking about brain volume now.
Brain volume?
Yeah.
That says, definitely sounds made up.
So it says protective factors such as greenness and generous destination accessibility were negatively correlated with an anxiety symptom group mediated by brain regions, etc. So one, it says protective factors include greenness, at least for anxiety, which is, again, a relatively cheap I mean, parks are a little more expensive to maintain, but like putting trees in a lot of places is like super cheap. And then you said just
more trees, huh?
So what did you say in response to this? You added a comment.
Which part? To replacing Strodes?
No, to the greenery for mental health.
Oh yeah, why don't you just live in the woods instead?
So you could, but living in the woods would require leaving all of your friends and family behind and quitting your job, and then your full-time job becomes scavenging, trying to catch little critters to survive. And you could do that, but
couldn't you just do it and live off of SNAP and Medicaid?
There's probably a work requirement that shows you either are unable to work or you're seeking work.
That's right.
Yeah. But also, like, people who lived in tribal society, like people who lived in ancestral societies in like the wild, they didn't live by themselves. They lived with other people. they would be like roving bands. And so unless you can convince a group of like 10 of your buddies to like go move to the forest, it's probably not going to be that good for your mental health to live alone in the forest.
Yeah, not really.
So next,
I think that's a thing that comes up in the urban-rural divide, is everyone thinks their own way of living is better for mental health.
Well, I don't think the urban-rural, I don't know if that matters as much.
I don't know either.
Not really. Yeah. Here's another...
This is something I'm going to have to Google later.
Yeah, another thing that improves mental health. So it says exposure. So this is from the paper Environmental Research by Rugel et al. It says exposure to natural space, sense of community belonging, and adverse mental health outcomes across an urban region. So it says nature was indirectly but not directly linked with mental health benefits. So more of that, as we've said before. Public neighborhood nature were linked to higher sense of community belonging. Higher, and they called that SOC, sense of community belonging. So sense of community. Said higher SOC was linked to reduced depression, negative mental health, and distress. Sort of like Disney movie lesson, but also very true. And then nature improving mental health through SOC can be a win-win for urban planning. So the more community oriented your neighborhood is, the better it is for mental health.
How do you make it community oriented?
So we're actually going to talk about that later.
All right.
Next, you added a comment. Do you want to mention that now?
I think my comments in this section kind of go along the lines of, is it better or worse for you in the mental health domain to live in the city or the country? So I feel like there's positives and minuses, but I haven't read up on it, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, this isn't so much about like, is it better, is city or country better? It's more like what kind of city is better. Because like grid pattern is like irrelevant for like a farm, because it's like, okay, like does it really matter whether like the outline of your farm is shaped like a square versus like an oval? I don't think it really matters because everything's so far away. So a lot of this is focused specifically on the city and suburbs, because the suburbs are part of the metropolitan area. But there's a type of suburb that fits this profile. So this is not necessarily anti-suburb by any means. If you're talking about like a suburban area that's like a mile away from downtown, in a lot of cities, it's shaped like a grid pattern and it has like a lot of trees and it's quite nice. But then you also have suburbs where like, you like barely see your neighbors and there's like no vegetation other than like people's lawns. That's more the kind of angle that I'm kind of talking about. There's this other paper. So this is from this is also from Nature. Is this from No, it's from Scientific Reports. But it says urbanization, loneliness, and mental health model, a cross-sectional network analysis with a representative sample by a bunch of Polish researchers. It says here, and so this is specific to Poland, but explores the relationship of the physical environment and social factors with mental health and physical health. So this is in Silesia, Poland, with a couple thousand residents. So the final conclusion, the last sentence of the abstract says, mental health can be improved by social and architectural factors such as strengthening neighborhood cohesion and improving neglected buildings. So again, not very surprising.
No.
And let's go to the conclusion section. It says, compared with rural areas and small towns, mental health indices were improved in cities. However, even though urbanicity was not directly related to mental health, but was the most influential factor in the verified model in terms of the betweenness centrality. So living in urban areas is not directly related to mental health, but can be a bridge between mental health, social cohesion, physical health, and physical environment. So I think the best read I can have is that there's no clear, there's no data that shows living in a city makes you more mentally healthy than living in a rural area or vice versa. But it says that in the context of a city, there are certain factors that can influence mental health. Is kind of what I read there.
Yeah, that makes sense.